I had just never seen anything like that in my life. Farajanov is even offering kind of a different way to understand time. One of my favorite stories, which is probably not true, one of his most treasured possessions was a letter that Fellini sent him when he saw The Color of Pomegranates. It was a real puzzle, like what does even any of this mean, and where does it come from, and how is he allowed to make these films? I think that's one of the things that comes from his specifically cosmopolitan Tbilisi upbringing. I first saw Farajanov's films when I was in college. It was in an introductory film class, and the professor showed a clip or a couple of clips from Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, and I was completely bowled over. I had just never seen anything like that in my life, and I had seen other Soviet films before, like Tarkovsky and Eisenstein and so on, but Farajanov operated on a completely different plane. And the camera movement was just incredible. And then shortly after that, I started reading more about his work, and I saw The Color of Pomegranates. And it was a very different film because, of course, it was all static tableaus, like paintings with pantomime and so on. But I was even more enraptured by that film, just because it had this incredible precision and expressiveness to its poetics. But at the same time, it was a real puzzle, like what does even any of this mean, and where does it come from, and how is he allowed to make these films? And so these initial questions that I had really became the motivation for me to work on this book. That's an interesting question because I think most people that approach Farajanov's films know more about his filmmaking and less about his art, simply because his art, the largest collection of his art, of course, is in Armenia at the Farajanov Museum. I think his art, it's increasingly clear that his art was a very integral part of his creative personality. And I don't think that you can just separate his art and his filmmaking. And as I discussed in my talk, Farajanov as a transmedia artist, there's some really interesting interactions between his films and his artworks that really deserve greater exploration. So I think that if you look at his artworks with in addition to his films, you can understand the artworks better, but you can also especially understand his films better. The period in prison was very important for the development of his plastic arts, precisely because he wasn't able to make films. So he did drawings and he made collages with materials that he was able to access in the prisons. So his creativity just exploded in all sorts of different directions. At the same time, Farajanov's plastic artistic practices did not just begin then. So the earliest pieces by him date back to the 1950s. He did some paintings in the style of Diego Rivera, but at the same time they have some very playful Farajanov touches in them. But they're very good sort of imitations of Diego Rivera's style. He also did drawings on paper, and he did some initial collages, and he continued to create works like that. He did like a very interesting oil painting that he made in the 1960s, like a self-portrait of him at Hochbot, but wearing an embroidered Armenian or Ukrainian shirt. So he did create artworks regularly during that period, but it is when he was in prison that artistic practice really took off. However, I think that his work became even more interesting and more diverse in the 1980s when he started creating like three-dimensional assemblages and other things in addition to the collages from reproductions. Oh, that's a very complex question. I think he was kind of a contradictory individual, or at least different people had different perspectives of him based on when they saw him and under what context. On the one hand, he was very, he could be very ebullient and very creative, and as you mentioned, he would stage these elaborate happenings. I've also heard people say that they think that he may have been bipolar because he would go through periods like this where he was very energetic and very ebullient and creative, and then he would disappear for long periods of time. And this is something that I have not been able to confirm, but I have heard it from other people. And other people also spoke about like this great underlying sadness in his life, and sometimes that comes through as well. So, I don't really have the answer to that yet, and I'm not sure, if we can ultimately come to an answer, but I suspect that it might be a combination of all three. One of my favorite stories, which is probably not true, or at least it's elaborated, is in the Patrick Gazal's documentary, which they showed at the conference, where his father dealt in antiques, and he ran basically a commission shop. Although he was also accused of running a bordello too, apparently. So there's an interesting story there. Anyway, the story was that when the KGB came to the house, his mother made him swallow the jewels in order to hide them. And then he elaborated on that. He said that she made him do this more than once, and he elaborated on it further by saying that, when the jewels passed through, they had changed colors. Like this diamond was white and now it's yellow. And so she was, like very, very upset with him. And, obviously that's impossible, but it's a wonderful example of how he's able to turn, possibly a painful story from his childhood into something just really imaginative and creative. Of course, another layer to his identity is Russian, actually, because he was educated in a Russian school, and that's the language that he used most of the time. It's definitely the language that he wrote in. But I think, he was also very interested in European culture. He loved Italian cinema, and he felt a deep affinity for it, especially Pasolini, but also Fellini. One of his most treasured possessions was a letter that Fellini sent him when he saw The Color of Pomegranates. And he also really admired Yves Saint Laurent and, so he also liked French fashion and so on. So I think you're absolutely right that he was cosmopolitan. But I think also, this multilingual aspect to his identity is really interesting. And it's one of the things that makes him unique as an artist, I think, because it it opened up the possibility for him to even hear language in a different way. Like, one of the things that he's very sensitive to is the texture of language. So if I can use one example from his films, when he made the film Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, it was shot in Ukrainian, which was actually a little unusual at that time because they wanted to produce more films in Ukrainian, but they didn't even have enough trained actors to speak in Ukrainian, like in the 1950s in Ukrainian cinema. So Farajanov, when the film was supposed to be distributed in the Soviet Union, he absolutely insisted that it not be dubbed into Russian, which was very common at that time. But he really fought that point because he wanted the authentic texture of language to be preserved. And of course, by the time he made The Color of Pomegranates, the film, I think deliberately on his part, is impossible to dub. And I think that sensitivity to the texture of language is something that's really unique to Farajanov, and I think that's one of the things that comes from his specifically cosmopolitan Tbilisi upbringing. I haven't even thought about that, but believe it or not, yeah. I mean, because when I became interested in his work, it was right towards the end of his life. He passed away, and that was just I understand. It was an opportunity that had passed, and I mean, of course, it would have been really fascinating to meet with him. But I don't even know, like, would he just think that I was an annoying person? And because sometimes he really liked people, and other times he didn't. I actually kind of like being sort of a historian that's like gathering little bits here and there and putting some of these pieces together. And I've even come to appreciate the fact that I don't have the whole picture, and I never will, and that there's other people out there that can do that. And I think that's really interesting, and to me that's actually more rewarding, that you can have multiple perspectives on him and they don't even necessarily agree with each other. And every once in a while I come across some incredible story that somebody tells me that I haven't heard before, and to me that's actually what I find most rewarding, besides continually revisiting his films and his artworks.